Welcome to a series of brief but deep philosophical reflection. My name is Joseph, and I am simply trying to provide critical yet objective commentary on philosophy in order to carefully direct any and all along the path of right reason. This series, entitled Building a Proper Disposition, is dedicated to building a proper philosophical disposition in order to better tackle our abundant philosophical, theological, ethical, and practical dilemmas. What is my fundamental presupposition? That every person attests to his or her own personal beliefs out of some subjectively reasonable circumstance. Thus, I am aiming to illuminate the extent to which our subjective thinking may have become pure bias or even pure error. Remember, there can only be one truth, and this is out of philosophical necessity. A little philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's minds about to religion. Francis Bacon. Building a Proper Disposition. Presentation 7. Arena of Comparative Religion. In the previous presentation, I definitively outlined the essential function of religion and its necessary procession from some philosophical system. In short, our philosophical systems predispose our reasoning to subjective interpretation that aims to align with objective conclusions. These objective conclusions are the postulations proposed by religion. In other words, the essential form of religion is to enact what we find reasonable, while the essential function of religion is to provide objective truth. In this presentation, I will demonstrate a means of proper scrutiny as we enter the arena of comparative religion, and I welcome you to test and critique its validity and fairness. The presupposition is simple. If religion functions as an objective truth, then one among the many religious models must be closest to objective truth. So where would I begin? First, I will actuate this presupposition by claiming all that is present in the world is fair game. Texts, narratives, myths, research, theorems. If it overtly or implicitly begs objective truth, then it's on the table. Now, accessibility to this literally full extent of literature and religious texts does seem daunting, but this is a fundamentally prerequisite position to hold, that any religion has the chance to prove itself to be objectively true. Thus, I take this position. For philosophy, theology, humanities, and literature scholars, we already understand just how in over our heads this endeavor is. For even scholars from long ago have attempted such a feat as rendering cohesive conclusions from exorbitant textual analyses. And ironically, their writings and publications have compounded the difficulty of future attempts toward the same feat. In other words, if we were to assume that all texts of today hold equal relevance to objective truth, we would be misperceiving what is actually accountable. Cookbooks, TV guides, and technical manuals don't have much bearing on objective truth, do they? How about discourses by Kant, Nietzsche, or Russell Brand? Articulations from the councils of Ephesus, Trent, or Vatican II? Writings of Al-Ghazali, St. Augustine, Marcus Aurelius, or Josephus? Expositions by Anton LaVey, Blavatsky, or Crowley? Categorically, these are all textual publications meant to convey clarity or even to present substantially objective postulations. But what should also be measured is their historical relevance. Therefore, historicity is the first basic metric by which I would begin the next calling of textual wheat. But this requires some predisposed knowledge and awareness, doesn't it? We cannot just blindly assume historical narrative. Thus, we must have a grasp of world history, at least enough to begin accurately bridging texts, cultures, and impacts. In other words, history is grounded in evidential and testimonial narratives that reveal the most fundamental portions of objective truth, what has historically occurred. This includes civilizations, ancient and modern, peoples, tribal and civilized, lands, pillaged and planted, and cultures, influential and forgotten. While I am open to any and all objective stances made in the world, I still expect to see historical continuity and cohesion. After fortifying our worldview through study, research, and reflection, we become more capable to distinguish what is more useful or more futile in the field of comparative religion. Seeing how ancient civilizations had divine creation myths just as much as some cultures today, seeing how Greek and Chinese philosophers were grasping universal and practical virtues within a similar time period, seeing how Siddhartha, Moses, Guru Nanak, Christ, Kongzi, and Muhammad all became extremely influential characters who undeniably sprouted followers, seeing the rise or fall of prominent civilizations, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, Franks, Arabs, Russia, Chinese dynasties, Goths, Celts, Vikings, Vedic and Brahmin Hindus, and on and on and on. If we want to accurately account for our current time, we have to account for the blood that runs in the veins of history. An example of potential historical discontinuity within a religion would be Hinduism. It is known that Vedic scriptures have been rearticulated through preceding Mahabharata or Upanishad texts, such that there is dissimilarity within its own historical accountability. Explanatory reasons for this exist, but it would require additional presuppositions to consider that preceding forms of Hinduism sincerely correlate to traditional Vedas. Another significant example includes Abrahamic faiths. Christianity relies on Judaism's truths just as much as Islam relies on Christianity's errors. Development or fulfillment emphasize reasonable continuity, while contention or rearticulations emphasize potential discontinuity. Following historical scrutiny, I would then highlight categorical similarities as a second metric. For example, we can readily accept concepts such as God, eternity, spiritual beings, or even rightly ordered living as seemingly standalone topics that are described within various religious models. Yes, there are a lot of considerations to consider, but comprehensive understanding of religious teaching, history, and development assists in impartially recognizing the beautiful qualities of religion that simply stand out as uniquely unifying. Let's even use this short list of categorical components. For example, rightly ordered living. How is this achieved? An eightfold path? Removal of karma? Repentance from sin? Some kausa or panth? Some cleansing of impurities? What about spiritual beings? Angels, devas, avatars, demons? What about eternal and temporal relationships? Reincarnation, resurrection, deification, nirvana, kingdoms of heaven or kingdoms of the world? What about God? Internal, external, triune, one person, eternal or temporal? There are many categorical overlaps within religious models, and these should become the topics of scrutinizing similarities. Can any conclusion result from scrutinizing similarities? Well, remember from a previous presentation that it is most reasonable that religions contain either parts of truth or even describe one truth in different ways. Thus, the similarities are meant to condense the objective criteria that are present throughout. In other words, focusing on similarities first helps us gauge what kind of objective standard by which we can further scrutinize religious models. We essentially use the test to take the test. The conclusive similarities, even if broad or simple categorical distinctions, are what make our presupposition that at least one of these religious models is closest to objective truth more tangible. Alright, we have now gathered some categorical basis of what an objective religion should include. And because I find theism to be one of these categories, I will address atheistic refutation here. If objective truth is in fact that none of the theistic religions are true, and that ultimately God does not exist, then there is still absolutely no harm in scavenging through the bones of dead superstitions like curious vultures, because, even regardless of atheism being true, we would not be able to deny that religious models still do influence the world, such that they are still important to reconcile. I concede that even after these two fundamental steps of scrutiny, some may be inclined towards atheism. But my reasoning for adopting theistic inclination is largely due to the existence of transcendent categories and universal principles. Another refutation will be drawn here for occultists or esoteric spiritualists, because they appear neglected within this process. Although there is a rich occult history demonstrating religious practices proceeding from philosophical systems, I think history shows that these types of spiritualism tend to be divergent and contradictory. For example, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Freemasonry, and other types of occultic religious forms cannot attest to the same level of historical foundationalism as, let's say, Hinduism or Judaism. They must concede that they were created as contrary to something already present. Thus, I find this to be less compelling. This does transition us to the third metric of scrutiny, however, which is contradiction. I stated in the previous presentation that contradiction is an undeniable sign of error. Therefore, after having squeezed out similar positions among religious models, we can then sift through what is remaining by pointing out the differences. And boy, are there many differences. While categorical distinctions assist in uncovering similarities, differences usually require deeper doctrinal positions to uncover. This is because one umbrella term, such as Hinduism or Christianity, can consist of various sects that are separated not by categorical topics, but by specific doctrinal positions of those topics. But still remember, contradiction does not mean intentional or even immediate falsity. It is just a sign that something erroneous has been maintained. For example, karma and sin are categorically similar, but are definitively different. Thus, purpose of scrutinizing contradiction is to decide which of two contradictory positions is closer to truth, because out of necessity, one must be. Now, there has been one ace in the hole that pertains to the initial historical continuity portion of scrutiny. Basically, it is this. Every religion must also necessarily account for every other within its objective conclusion. Take a moment to reflect on that. If one religion is objectively true, which is the presupposition prior to scrutinizing comparative religion, then it must necessarily account for every other religion as well. To expedite this clarification, let us ask ourselves one important question. Who was Jesus Christ? Why is this such an important question? Because historical testimony deems it necessary to account for the Christian narrative historically. Now, when I say historical testimony, I am not just referring to gospel narratives. I'm referring to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, the writings of Roman governor Pliny and Roman historian Tacitus, and even the testimonies and narratives of the earliest proclaimers of Christianity itself, including martyrs, bishops, and church fathers, who have upheld not just the person of Jesus, but have provided witness to their struggles and articulations. In other words, the person of Christ becomes a firm historical standard by which all other religions can be measured. For example, Hinduism can account for Christ as an avatar, or Islam can account for Christ as a prophet, among others in the Abrahamic tradition. These are not mere concessions or articulations. They are necessary in order to uphold their own historical continuity. In other words, if a religion contradicts the existence of the person of Christ, then it is a sign of falsity because it does not uphold historical accountability. Meanwhile, a religion that does observe the person of Christ must reasonably mold an image of him that is suitable to its own teachings. Now, if a Hindu calls Christ an avatar, this is acceptable Hindu teaching. Or if a Buddhist calls Christ a bodhisattva, this too is acceptable Buddhist teaching. These are also both categorically similar, even to the Christian doctrine. Yes, definitively different, but still categorically forgiving. However, once a Muslim denies the deity of Christ, or once an Orthodox Jew refers to the Talmud and states Christ is a blasphemer, there is no longer a categorical similarity. Instead, it is intentional opposition to another religious model without categorical reconciliation. In other words, the most contentious of all religious contradictions not only include Jesus Christ, but are within the same family of Abrahamic faiths. These are not objective articulations, like the aforementioned Hindu or Buddhist teachings, but are instead purely subjective criticisms. Now, there are plenty of Muslim and Jewish apologists who will support their claims and deny the validity of Christian claims. I get it. And I consider myself, even now, as a recent Catholic convert, very open to understanding alternate and contradictory sides of arguments. However, within the historical context that the Quran was composed nearly 3 centuries after the Council of Nicaea, which affirmed Christ as fully man and fully God, or even the historical context that the Talmud was compiled over a similar course of time, I am confident, and reasonably justified, in proclaiming that these contradictory doctrines were not genuine objective articulations that are naturally expected from philosophical models, but were instead made in retaliation to Christianity. And alas, that is where I have humbly staked my claim in the arena of comparative religious studies. I have done, and still continue to do research in order to reflect and reevaluate my position. I try to remain as objective and unbiased as I can be, and I always concede the benefit of the doubt to alternate or differing points of view. I truly hope this demonstration of proper scrutiny has revealed how religious models proceeding from philosophical systems should uphold objective articulation rather than subjective criticism. This is most necessary within any religious text. Because, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves if we truly believe that we are following contentious and bitter doctrines or enlightened and inspired doctrines. Whether theistic or atheistic, whether Eastern or Western, we owe it to truth itself to find justification for our positions. Christ has become the objective standard by which all religions are measured. And that's a fact.
In the dead of the night, as his life slips away, as he reads by the light of a star far away, holding on, holding off, holding out, holding in, could you be this old and have your life just begin? It begins. Tell me, how many times can this story be told? After all of these years, it should all sound so old, but it somehow rings through in the back of my mind as I